December 7th, 1944. A cramped intelligence office in the Bendler Block, Berlin. Colonel Alexis von Roenne, head of Foreign Armies West, sat at his desk studying a classified American aviation magazine that had reached Berlin through neutral Switzerland. The publication, dated September 1944, contained what appeared to be routine industrial news, photographs of factory expansions, or production statistics that American censors had somehow allowed to pass. But the numbers on the page before him represented something far more devastating than any bombing raid. The article described Boeing's Wichita plant producing 4.2 B-29 Superfortress bombers per day, every single day, as standard production. Von Roenne had spent the previous week cross-referencing this single claim against every source available to German intelligence, searching desperately for evidence of American exaggeration or propaganda inflation. Instead, every independent source confirmed what seemed mathematically impossible. The Americans were mass-producing the most technologically advanced aircraft ever built, at rates that exceeded Germany's total bomber production across all types. He looked up at his colleague, Major Wilhelm Keitel of the Luftwaffe intelligence staff, who had travelled from Luftwaffe headquarters specifically to discuss the B-29 problem. Between them lay scattered photographs, technical intelligence reports, interrogation summaries from captured American airmen, and agent reports from neutral countries. Every document told the same apocalyptic story. America had developed and deployed a strategic bomber that rendered every assumption about air warfare obsolete, and they were building these aircraft faster than Germany could produce simple training planes. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress had first entered German intelligence awareness in early 1942, shortly after the prototype's initial flight. At that time, German analysts had dismissed early reports as typical American hyperbole, claims about performance capabilities that no bomber could actually achieve. The specifications seemed fantastical compared to existing heavy bombers. A pressurized cabin allowing crews to operate in shirt-sleeve comfort at 30,000 feet, remote-controlled gun turrets directed by a central fire control system using analog computers, a bomb load of 20,000 pounds carried over distances exceeding 3,000 miles, 4 Wright R-3350 radial engines, each producing over 2,000 horsepower, driving an aircraft weighing 60 tons at takeoff. These specifications, when first reported, appeared to violate fundamental principles of aircraft design that German engineers understood. The Luftwaffe's own attempt at a long-range heavy bomber, the Heinkel He-177, had proven a catastrophic failure despite years of development and enormous resource investment. The aircraft suffered from chronic engine problems, structural weaknesses, and never achieved its design specifications. Germany had abandoned strategic bomber development by 1942, focusing instead on medium bombers and fighters where German engineering excelled. Yet the Americans claimed to have developed a bomber far more capable than anything Germany had attempted, and intelligence suggested they were actually producing these aircraft in quantity. The reports seemed too extraordinary to believe. Von Roenne himself had initially filed early B-29 intelligence under probable propaganda in late 1942, but by 1943, the evidence became impossible to dismiss. The first undeniable proof came from signals intelligence. German monitoring stations tracking American military communications began intercepting references to very heavy bombardment groups equipped with aircraft designated B-29. The communications patterns suggested these were operational units, not experimental squadrons. Training activities in Kansas, deployment preparations through India, operational planning for missions against Japan, all confirmed the B-29 was real, operational, and being deployed in significant numbers. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights over neutral Turkey in mid-1943 photographed what appeared to be B-29 bombers at American air bases in Egypt, though analysis proved inconclusive due to distance and image quality. But agent reports from Switzerland and Sweden, where German intelligence maintained extensive networks monitoring Allied aircraft production, began providing consistent information about B-29 manufacturing. The scale of the American effort emerged gradually through multiple independent sources. An agent in Sweden reported that Boeing had constructed an entirely new aircraft factory in Wichita, Kansas, specifically for B-29 production. The facility covered millions of square feet, employed tens of thousands of workers, and used assembly line techniques adapted from automotive manufacturing. This single factory, according to the report, had capacity exceeding Germany's entire bomber production infrastructure. Von Roenne had initially questioned these figures, suspecting the agent had confused the report or been fed disinformation. But subsequent intelligence from completely independent sources confirmed the same basic facts. Bell Aircraft had built another massive B-29 factory in Marietta, Georgia. The Martin Company operated a third production line in Omaha, Nebraska. Boeing maintained a fourth assembly plant in Renton, Washington, 4 separate factories, each capable of mass-producing the world's most advanced bomber, represented industrial capacity that seemed to exist in a different reality from Germany's war economy. The technical intelligence proved, even more disturbing than the production figures. In June 1944, the first B-29 raid against Japan struck the Yawata steelworks in Kyushu. German intelligence obtained detailed reports about this mission through Japanese sources. The aircraft had flown from bases in China, covering distances exceeding 1,500 miles each way while carrying substantial bomb loads. They had operated at altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled to intercept them. Several bombers returned to base despite heavy damage from anti-aircraft fire, demonstrating structural integrity far exceeding previous bomber designs. Japanese technical intelligence provided the first accurate assessment of B-29 capabilities based on actual combat experience. The pressurized cabin was real, allowing crew efficiency at extreme altitudes where cold and oxygen deprivation would incapacitate crews in conventional bombers. The remote gun turrets worked as described, providing defensive firepower without the drag and weight penalties of manned turret positions. The central fire control system allowed any gunner to control multiple turrets, creating overlapping fields of fire that Japanese fighter pilots found nearly impossible to penetrate. Most significantly, the engines proved remarkably reliable despite their enormous power output. The Wright R-3350, while experiencing teething problems during early production, had been refined into a power plant that exceeded German engine performance by substantial margins. Each engine produced 2,200 horsepower for takeoff, sustaining high power output for extended periods. Germany's best bomber engines, by comparison, struggled to maintain 1,500 horsepower and suffered chronic reliability problems. Major Keitel spread several photographs across von Roenne's desk. These images, captured by Japanese reconnaissance and transmitted through neutral channels, showed B-29 formations over Japanese targets. The photographs were grainy, taken from ground level by Japanese observers, but they conveyed the massive scale of the American bomber offensive. Dozens of aircraft operating in coordinated formations, each bomber larger than Germany's heaviest aircraft, delivering bomb tonnage that exceeded anything the Luftwaffe could deploy. The Japanese estimate, American B-29 strength in the Pacific, at approximately 200 aircraft by November 1944, Keitel said quietly. They project this force will grow to 500 aircraft by March 1945 and potentially exceed 1,000 by summer. These are not exaggerations. Our independent sources confirm similar figures. Von Roenne studied the photographs in silence. 200 B-29 seconds represented more heavy bomber strength than the entire Luftwaffe possessed across all bomber types. The projection of 1,000 B-29 seconds seemed almost beyond comprehension. Each aircraft cost approximately $640,000, according to American budget documents that had leaked through neutral channels. 1,000 B-29 seconds represented an investment of $640 million in aircraft alone, not counting engines, spare parts, ground equipment, training, or operational infrastructure. How is this possible? Von Roenne asked, though he already knew the answer. The B-29 is the most complex aircraft ever built. How can the Americans produce such machines in these quantities? Keitel opened a folder containing intelligence summaries compiled over the previous 18 months. They have systematized the process in ways we never imagined possible. The Boeing Wichita plant doesn't build individual aircraft through traditional methods. They use automotive assembly line techniques, moving the airframe through multiple stations. Different sections of the aircraft, nose, wings, fuselage, tail, are built simultaneously in separate areas of the factory, then brought together for final assembly. He pulled out a technical drawing reconstructed from multiple intelligence sources. The factory employs specialized jigs and fixtures that ensure components fit together properly without requiring skilled craftsmen to make individual adjustments. Parts are standardized and interchangeable. Workers are trained for specific tasks rather than building entire components. Quality control uses statistical sampling rather than individual inspection. The entire production system is optimized for volume. Von Roenne examined the drawing, seeing immediately how radically different this approach was from German aircraft manufacturing. Luftwaffe bombers were still built largely through traditional methods, with skilled craftsmen assembling components, making adjustments to ensure proper fit, creating aircraft that were in many ways individual products. The German emphasis on quality and craftsmanship produced excellent aircraft, but the production rates could never match American mass manufacturing. The Americans began with this production system? Von Roenne asked. They designed the aircraft specifically for mass production? Yes, Keitel confirmed. Boeing's engineers worked simultaneously on aircraft design and manufacturing processes. They anticipated production problems and designed solutions into the aircraft itself. The B-29 uses extensive welding rather than riveting in many areas, which is faster but requires different skills. They employ magnesium alloys in non-critical structures to reduce weight without compromising strength. The wing uses a single spar design that simplified manufacturing compared to traditional multi-spar construction. Every design decision considered not just performance but production efficiency. This represented a fundamental philosophical difference that von Roenne found difficult to fully comprehend. German engineering tradition emphasized perfection in design, creating the best possible aircraft regardless of manufacturing complexity. The assumption had always been that superior quality would overcome numerical disadvantages. But the Americans had inverted this logic. They had deliberately sacrificed some performance optimization to create an aircraft that could be produced in overwhelming numbers while still achieving performance superior to anything Germany had built. The production figures, von Roenne said, returning to the fundamental question. Can we verify them independently? Keitel nodded. Multiple sources confirm consistent data. The Boeing Wichita plant reached peak production of approximately 100 aircraft per month by mid-1944. The Bell Marietta plant achieved similar rates. Martin Omaha and Boeing Renton each contribute additional production. Combined output from all four plants exceeds 350 B-29 seconds per month. The mathematics were devastating. 350 B-29 seconds per month meant over 4,000 aircraft annually, though actual production would be somewhat lower due to startup delays and modifications. But even conservative estimates suggested American B-29 production for 1944 would exceed 2,000 aircraft. Germany's total bomber production for 1944 across all types, Heinkel 111s, Junkers 88s, Dornier 217s, everything combined, totaled approximately 3,000 aircraft. America was producing more of its most advanced heavy bombers than Germany produced of all bomber types combined, and this represented only one category of American aircraft production. The statistics on fighter production were equally apocalyptic. American factories were simultaneously producing thousands of P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, each type in numbers exceeding total German fighter production. The cost implications, von Roenne said, calculating mentally, if each B-29 costs $640,000 and they're producing 350 per month, that represents over $200 million monthly investment in this single aircraft type, over $2 billion annually. Correct, Keitel confirmed, and that figure represents only direct aircraft costs. The B-29 program's total investment, including research and development, factory construction, tooling, training, support infrastructure, exceeds $3 billion. The Americans have spent more on the B-29 program than on their atomic bomb project. Von Roenne sat back, absorbing the implications. $3 billion represented approximately 12 billion Reichsmarks at official exchange rates. Germany's entire military budget for 1944 totaled roughly 80 billion Reichsmarks. The Americans had invested an amount equivalent to 15% of Germany's entire annual military spending on a single aircraft type, and they were doing this while simultaneously funding massive programs for tanks, ships, artillery, and every other category of military equipment. The fundamental disparity in economic capacity was so enormous that it defied comprehension. Germany had mobilized every resource, conquered most of Europe to exploit its industrial capacity, implemented slave labor on massive scales, and pushed production to what seemed like absolute limits. Yet America, fighting a two-ocean war while maintaining civilian prosperity, was outproducing Germany by factors of 3 to 5 across nearly every category of military equipment. The strategic implications are clear, Keitel said quietly. If the Americans deployed B-29 seconds against Germany with the same intensity they're using against Japan, our industrial capacity would be destroyed within months. The aircraft operates at altitudes where our fighters struggle to intercept. The defensive firepower makes approaching these bombers extremely costly. The bomb load per aircraft exceeds our heaviest bombers by factors of 3 or 4, and they can produce losses indefinitely while we cannot. Von Roenne knew this assessment was accurate, though saying it aloud felt like acknowledging defeat. The Luftwaffe had developed jet fighters like the Me-262 that could theoretically intercept B-29 seconds, but production numbers remained tiny. Germany was building perhaps hundreds of jet fighters, while America built thousands of bombers monthly. The mathematics of attrition made German technological superiority strategically irrelevant. Why aren't they using B-29 seconds against us? Von Roenne asked, voicing the question that had troubled intelligence analysts for months. If these aircraft can strike Japan from such distances, they could certainly reach Germany from English bases. Why commit them exclusively to the Pacific? Keitel pulled out another intelligence summary. Theater priorities and strategic calculation. The Pacific distances require the B-29's range. B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds can reach German targets from English bases, so the Americans see no need to redirect B-29 production from the Pacific campaign. They're effectively treating the European and Pacific theaters as completely separate wars, with sufficient production capacity to fully prosecute both simultaneously. This casual distribution of overwhelming military power between two separate global conflicts demonstrated American industrial dominance more clearly than any production statistics. Germany was fighting desperately on 3 major fronts: Eastern, Western, and Mediterranean, constantly shuffling limited resources between competing priorities, always short of aircraft, tanks, fuel, and ammunition. America was simultaneously conducting massive campaigns in Europe and the Pacific while maintaining reserve capacity and steadily increasing production across all categories. The intelligence files contained additional disturbing information about B-29 operational capabilities. The aircraft's pressurized cabin meant crews could operate effectively for much longer missions than conventional bomber crews, who suffered extreme fatigue from cold, oxygen deprivation, and physical stress. The B-29's modern systems included radar for navigation and bombing, allowing operations in weather that would ground conventional bombers. The aircraft incorporated self-sealing fuel tanks, armored crew positions, and sophisticated fire suppression systems that dramatically improved survivability compared to earlier designs. Most significantly, the B-29 represented a complete weapons system rather than just an aircraft. American training programs produced highly skilled crews using standardized procedures developed through extensive testing. Maintenance systems ensured high aircraft availability rates. Supply chains delivered spare parts and equipment efficiently. Intelligence provided detailed target information. Weather reconnaissance determined optimal attack conditions. The entire operation functioned with industrial efficiency that made German bomber operations look improvisational and chaotic. Von Roenne reviewed interrogation reports from captured American airmen that provided additional insights into B-29 operations. Crew members described training programs lasting many months, using sophisticated simulators and actual flight training in aircraft identical to combat models. They discussed maintenance systems where specialized crews could conduct engine changes in hours rather than days. They mentioned supply systems where spare parts arrived reliably, where aircraft were grounded for maintenance rather than pushed into operations with marginal equipment. The contrast with Luftwaffe operations was stark and humiliating. German bomber crews often flew aircraft that were barely airworthy, with maintenance delayed by parts shortages. Training programs had been compressed to conserve fuel. Crew quality had declined as experienced airmen were killed, and replacements arrived with minimal flight time. The entire German air warfare system was slowly collapsing under the weight of attrition it could not sustain, while American operations improved steadily as production increased and experience accumulated. A particular interrogation report caught von Roenne's attention. A captured B-17 crew member, shot down over Germany in October 1944, had casually mentioned that his bomb group was scheduled to convert from B-17 seconds to B-29 seconds in early 1945. The interrogators had questioned him extensively about this statement. The airman had been remarkably forthcoming, apparently seeing no security value in protecting information about aircraft types or production schedules. He had explained that several B-17 groups in England were scheduled for conversion to B-29 seconds, once production exceeded Pacific theater requirements. The European bombing campaign would eventually transition entirely to the Superfortress, providing even greater bomb tonnage and operational flexibility. He had mentioned this as simple fact, without any suggestion of exaggeration or propaganda purpose. The Americans apparently considered B-29 deployment to Europe inevitable once production capacity exceeded Pacific demands. Von Roenne passed this report to Keitel. This suggests they're planning to eventually deploy B-29 seconds against Germany once Pacific production exceeds requirements. Keitel nodded grimly. We've seen similar indications from other sources. The Americans view the B-29 as their standard heavy bomber moving forward. B-17 and B-24 production is already declining as factories transition to other aircraft types or prepare for post-war production. By mid-1945, the B-29 may be the only heavy bomber in American production. The timeline implications were clear. If Germany continued fighting into mid or late 1945, they would face B-29 bombing campaigns in addition to existing attacks by B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds. The combined bombing weight would exceed anything experienced thus far. German industrial production, already declining under Allied bombing, would collapse entirely. City after city would be destroyed. The civilian population would experience devastation matching what American bombers were inflicting on Japan. Intelligence reports from Japan provided preview of what B-29 operations against Germany might achieve. American bombers had begun low-level incendiary attacks against Japanese cities in March 1944, creating firestorms that killed tens of thousands and destroyed square miles of urban area. The tactics were brutally effective against cities built primarily of wood, but they would work equally well against any urban area. German cities, while more substantially built, would burn just as readily under concentrated incendiary attack. The Americans had demonstrated they possessed both the technical capacity and the moral willingness to conduct strategic bombing campaigns of unprecedented destructiveness. They had the industrial base to sustain these operations indefinitely. They had the organizational capability to coordinate 1,000 bomber raids as routine operations, and they had the political support to continue bombing until every German city was reduced to rubble if necessary. Von Roenne looked up at Keitel. What recommendations have you prepared for the Luftwaffe staff? Keitel's expression showed the same resignation that von Roenne felt. We can recommend improved fighter production, deployment of jets in greater numbers, better early warning systems, enhanced anti-aircraft defenses. But these are tactical measures that might slow the inevitable without changing fundamental strategic realities. The Americans have such overwhelming production capacity that no defensive measures can succeed. We can inflict casualties, delay their advance, make them pay for every target, but we cannot prevent their ultimate victory. The words hung in the air between them, professional military officers acknowledging what political leadership refused to accept. Germany had lost the industrial war. The outcome had probably been determined in 1943, when American production reached full stride. By 1944, the disparity was so extreme that continued fighting merely increased the scale of inevitable defeat without changing the outcome. The B-29 is not just an aircraft, von Roenne said slowly, working through the implications. It represents the entire American approach to warfare. Industrial capacity applied with ruthless efficiency, technology mass-produced rather than carefully perfected, operations conducted with overwhelming force rather than tactical finesse. This is a completely different conception of military power than what German military tradition teaches. Keitel nodded. We trained to believe that quality overcomes quantity, that tactical brilliance defeats material superiority, that willpower and courage matter more than industrial production. The Americans have demonstrated that modern industrial warfare makes those principles obsolete. They've created weapons systems where quantity has a quality all its own, where overwhelming material advantage makes tactical considerations irrelevant. This represented perhaps the most painful lesson of the entire war. German military excellence, the product of centuries of Prussian military tradition, of careful training and doctrinal development, of emphasis on quality and craftsmanship, had proven inadequate against enemies who simply produced more weapons faster. The Wehrmacht remained probably the most tactically proficient military force in the world. German tanks were superior to most Allied tanks. German artillery was excellent. German soldiers were well trained and highly motivated. None of this mattered when facing enemies who could replace losses immediately, while German strength declined through attrition. The B-29 Superfortress embodied this brutal reality. A single B-29 cost more than many German fighters, but America built B-29 seconds faster than Germany built fighters, while simultaneously building fighters in even greater numbers. The economic disparity was so extreme that careful German production planning and resource allocation looked pathetic compared to American industrial abundance. Von Roenne gathered the intelligence reports and photographs into a file. I will prepare a comprehensive analysis for the High Command, though I expect it will be received with the same skepticism as previous reports about American production capacity. They still believe willpower matters more than industrial output, Keitel said bitterly. That German tactical superiority can overcome numerical disadvantages, that secret weapons will somehow change strategic realities. The leadership cannot accept that we're being defeated not by enemy brilliance, but by simple arithmetic. This was the tragedy that intelligence analysts had lived with since late 1943. They understood the mathematical inevitability of German defeat, documented it meticulously, presented it clearly. Their warnings were systematically ignored by leadership who preferred comforting fantasies to devastating reality. Professional military assessment was subordinated to ideology and wishful thinking. The B-29 Superfortress represented the culmination of trends that intelligence officers had been tracking for years. American industrial mobilization that exceeded all predictions. Production rates that seemed physically impossible yet were consistently verified. Resource allocation that treated expensive weapons systems as expendable. Operational planning that assumed unlimited supply and overwhelming force. Every aspect of American military power demonstrated the decisive advantage of industrial capacity in modern warfare. Germany had entered the war assuming that tactical superiority and quick victories would overcome any material disadvantages. The assumption proved catastrophically wrong. Industrial wars between modern nations were won in factories before they were decided on battlefields. America's factories could produce more, faster, and better than German industry, while simultaneously maintaining civilian prosperity and funding research into even more advanced weapons. The intelligence file on von Roenne's desk contained roughly 4 pounds of paper, technical specifications, production statistics, operational analyses, interrogation reports, photographic evidence. 4 pounds of paper documenting why Germany could not win the war. 4 pounds of paper that would be filed, briefly reviewed by staff officers, and ultimately ignored by leadership, who refused to accept mathematical reality. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The B-29 story had one particularly ironic twist that exemplified American industrial capacity. In early 1944, the Americans had conducted an elaborate deception operation involving the B-29. They flew a single Superfortress, nicknamed the Hobo Queen, to several British airfields. The aircraft was prominently displayed, photographed by local press, and mentioned in propaganda materials specifically designed to reach Germany. The intention was to deceive German intelligence into believing B-29 seconds would be deployed against Germany from British bases, forcing the Luftwaffe to prepare defences against a threat that didn't exist. The deception worked perfectly. German intelligence noted the presence of B-29 seconds in England, prepared defensive plans, allocated resources to counter the anticipated threat. Luftwaffe commanders discussed tactics for intercepting the Superfortress at high altitude. Anti-aircraft units received briefings on the new bomber's capabilities. Enormous attention and resources focused on defending against B-29 raids from England that never materialized. But the deeper irony was that the Americans could afford such elaborate deception precisely because they had B-29 seconds to spare for propaganda purposes. They could deploy a bomber worth over $600,000, probably the most expensive single aircraft in existence, on a mission that had no combat value whatsoever. The casual waste of such resources for deception purposes itself demonstrated overwhelming industrial capacity. German intelligence eventually understood the Hobo Queen operation was deception, but by the time they reached this conclusion, the underlying message had become clear. America possessed such enormous production capacity that they could deploy their most advanced bombers for propaganda operations while simultaneously conducting massive Pacific campaigns. The deception succeeded not through fooling German analysts, but through demonstrating casual abundance that Germany could never match. Von Roenne stood and walked to his office window, looking out over Berlin. The city showed visible damage from Allied bombing, though the worst destruction was yet to come. Somewhere beyond the horizon, American factories were producing B-29 seconds at rates exceeding 4 aircraft daily. Each day, more Superfortresses rolled off assembly lines than Germany produced heavy bombers in a week. Each week, American production exceeded Germany's monthly bomber output. Each month, the disparity grew wider as American capacity increased, while German production declined under Allied bombing. The war had become a race between German collapse and Allied victory, with the outcome never in doubt. The only remaining questions were timing and cost. How long would Germany continue fighting against mathematical certainty? How many more cities would be destroyed? How many more people would die before leadership accepted what intelligence analysts had documented for over a year? Industrial capacity determined victory in modern war, and America possessed industrial capacity that made continued German resistance futile. The B-29 Superfortress was not just an aircraft. It was a symbol of American industrial dominance, of production capacity that seemed to operate in a different economic reality from Germany's desperate resource management. $3 billion invested in a single bomber program, 4 factories producing hundreds of aircraft monthly, thousands of highly trained crews, supply systems delivering parts across oceans, research programs developing even more advanced variants. The entire system functioned with casual efficiency that made German achievements look primitive by comparison. Major Keitel prepared to return to Luftwaffe headquarters. "What will you recommend in your report?" Von Roenne turned from the window, I will present the facts. B-29 production capacity, operational capabilities, probable deployment scenarios, if the war continues into 1945. I will note that defensive measures cannot prevent American strategic bombing from achieving its objectives. I will observe that continued resistance will only increase the ultimate cost without changing the outcome. And you expect these recommendations to be accepted? No, von Roenne said quietly. I expect they will be filed, ignored, and forgotten. Just as previous reports about American tank production were ignored, just as analyses of Allied shipping capacity were dismissed, just as evidence of overwhelming Allied material superiority has been systematically rejected, the leadership prefers fantasy to reality. The two officers stood in silence, understanding the terrible burden of knowing truths that could not change policy. Von Roenne would prepare his report, document every fact, present irrefutable evidence. The High Command would acknowledge receipt, file the document, and continue planning as if industrial reality did not constrain military possibilities. Professional competence became irrelevant when confronted with willful blindness at the highest levels of leadership. Keitel departed, leaving von Roenne alone with the intelligence files. He began drafting the formal report, knowing it was probably futile but compelled by professional duty to document the facts. The report would eventually total 47 pages, with extensive appendices containing production statistics, technical specifications, operational analyses, and strategic recommendations. It would be one of the most comprehensive intelligence assessments produced by Foreign Armies West during the entire war. The report would also be almost entirely ignored, but the story of German intelligence and the B-29 Superfortress extended beyond von Roenne's office in Berlin. Across Germany, other analysts were reaching similar conclusions through different evidence streams. Luftwaffe technical intelligence officers studying captured American equipment marveled at manufacturing quality that suggested unlimited resources. They examined machine tools marks on aluminum components, noting precision that could only come from extensively automated production. They studied electrical systems, finding standardized components used across multiple aircraft types, suggesting supply chains of enormous sophistication. Every captured American aircraft told the same story: abundant resources, advanced manufacturing, systematic approach to production that emphasized efficiency over craftsmanship. The Americans built weapons like they built automobiles, through mass production techniques that subordinated individual excellence to collective output. And this approach, contrary to every German assumption, produced weapons that were not only numerous, but also highly effective. By late 1944, German intelligence had compiled extensive technical files on the B-29 based on Japanese sources, neutral country reporting, and analysis of American publications. The composite picture revealed an aircraft that represented perhaps the most significant technological achievement in aviation history up to that point, not because of any single revolutionary feature, though many components were highly advanced, but because of the systematic integration of multiple technologies into a functional weapons system produced at scale. The pressurization system exemplified this integration. Earlier attempts at pressurized aircraft had proven unreliable and complex. The B-29 used a system developed by Garrett I Research that maintained cabin pressure equivalent to 8,000 feet altitude, while the aircraft operated above 30,000 feet. The system was not just functional but reliable, operating mission after mission with minimal maintenance. This reliability reflected extensive testing and refinement, the kind of development process that required time and resources Germany could not spare for any single system. The remote gun turrets represented another systematic achievement. Earlier attempts at remotely controlled guns had proven clumsy and ineffective. The B-29's General Electric system used analog computers to automatically compensate for aircraft speed, altitude, and maneuvering while tracking targets. Gunners operated through periscope sights with electrical controls, directing turrets that could engage multiple targets with remarkable accuracy. The system required sophisticated electrical engineering, precision manufacturing, and extensive crew training. It worked because Americans had invested the necessary resources to make it work, developing not just the hardware but the training systems and maintenance procedures to keep it operational. Even seemingly minor features revealed systematic approach to design. The B-29 used dual-wheeled tricycle landing gear, reducing ground pressure and allowing operations from rougher airfields than conventional tailwheel bombers. The wheels themselves were enormous, requiring tire manufacturing capacity that Germany did not possess. Americans had developed special synthetic rubber compounds, built tire factories specifically for B-29 production, and created supply chains to deliver these specialized components to assembly plants. They had solved not just the engineering problem, but the entire production and logistics system. The Wright R-3350 engine represented perhaps the most impressive technical achievement. Producing over 2,000 horsepower from a radial piston engine required metallurgy, precision manufacturing, and engineering optimization that pushed existing technology to its limits. Early production engines suffered chronic reliability problems, overheating, catching fire, failing catastrophically. American engineers had systematically identified and corrected each failure mode through exhaustive testing, eventually producing an engine that operated reliably under extreme conditions. Germany had attempted similar engine development programs and failed. The Daimler-Benz DB610, designed to produce similar power levels, never achieved production reliability. The engine suffered from cooling problems, structural failures, and fuel system complications that German engineers could not fully resolve. Development continued throughout the war, consuming enormous resources without producing a truly successful engine. The Americans had succeeded where German engineering failed, not through superior individual brilliance, but through systematic application of resources to development and testing. This pattern repeated across every aspect of the B-29 program. Where Germany attempted development programs and encountered problems that could not be solved given available time and resources, Americans simply continued development until problems were resolved. They could afford extensive testing. They could build multiple prototypes. They could manufacture special tooling and equipment. They could train thousands of specialized workers. The entire American approach to military technology reflected an economy with essentially unlimited resources compared to Germany's constrained circumstances. Intelligence analysts studying American aviation industry through neutral country sources discovered additional disturbing facts. The B-29 program, despite being the most expensive American aircraft program, represented only a fraction of total American aviation spending. Fighter production dwarfed bomber programs in total cost and production numbers. Transport aircraft production exceeded Germany's entire aviation output. Training aircraft were produced in quantities that seemed wasteful by German standards, with thousands dedicated solely to crew training for specific combat types. The American aviation industry employed over 2 million workers by 1944, producing approximately 100,000 military aircraft annually. Germany's aviation industry, operating at maximum capacity with extensive use of slave labor, employed perhaps 800,000 workers, producing roughly 40,000 aircraft annually. The Americans were producing 2.5 times more aircraft with only 2.5 times more workers, suggesting similar labor productivity. But American workers operated with better equipment, superior materials, and more extensive automation, suggesting actual productivity per worker substantially exceeded German levels. More disturbingly, American aircraft production was still increasing in late 1944, while German production had peaked and was beginning to decline under Allied bombing. American factories operated with ample electricity, raw materials, and components. German factories suffered chronic shortages of aluminum, electrical power, specialized steels, and countless other inputs necessary for aircraft production. Even when German factories escaped bombing, production declined due to supply chain disruptions and resource scarcity. The strategic implications extended beyond immediate military capabilities. American industrial dominance meant they could afford to develop next-generation weapons while fighting the current war. Intelligence reports indicated Americans were already testing jet-powered fighters and bombers, they were developing even larger long-range bombers. They were experimenting with new weapons, new tactics, new technologies that would provide continued advantages even as current systems became obsolete. Germany had staked everything on developing revolutionary weapons that might reverse military fortunes. Jet fighters, rocket-powered interceptors, ballistic missiles, advanced submarines, all represented desperate attempts to achieve qualitative breakthroughs that might overcome quantitative disadvantages. Some of these weapons showed genuine promise. The Me-262 jet fighter was legitimately superior to any Allied fighter when it entered service in 1944, but Germany produced fewer than 1,400 Me-262s total, while America produced over 21,000 P-51 Mustangs, which, while inferior individually, overwhelmed jets through sheer numbers. This had become the fundamental pattern of the war. Germany developed superior weapons in small numbers. Allies produced adequate weapons in overwhelming quantities. In every category, quality advantages disappeared against 5-to-1 or 10-to-1 numerical superiority. The Wehrmacht discovered this in tank combat, where excellent Panther and Tiger tanks were overwhelmed by masses of adequate Sherman tanks. The Luftwaffe discovered it in air combat, where superior German fighters faced impossible odds against Allied fighter swarms. German U-boats discovered it in the Atlantic, where improved submarines could not overcome Allied ship production that exceeded sinking rates by enormous margins. The B-29 Superfortress represented the ultimate expression of this American approach. Rather than developing the absolute best possible bomber regardless of cost or production difficulty, Americans had created a very good bomber that could be mass-produced efficiently. The B-29 was not perfect. The engines had reliability issues. The defensive armament was vulnerable to determined fighter attacks. The aircraft was challenging to fly and maintain. But these imperfections were acceptable because overwhelming numbers compensated for individual limitations. Von Roenne's report, when completed in January 1945, synthesized all available intelligence into comprehensive assessment of American strategic bombing capabilities. The document began with technical analysis of B-29 specifications, comparing performance to German bomber types. The comparison was humiliating. The B-29 exceeded German bombers in every performance category: bomb load, range, speed, altitude, defensive armament, crew comfort, operational flexibility. The report then analyzed American B-29 production capacity using data from multiple independent sources. Boeing Wichita had produced approximately 1,600 B-29 seconds by December 1944. Bell Marietta had built approximately 357 aircraft. Martin Omaha contributed approximately 200. Boeing Renton added several hundred more. Total production through December 1944 exceeded 2,500 aircraft, with production continuing at roughly 350 per month. These figures meant America had produced more B-29 seconds in 18 months than Germany had produced of all bomber types during the same period. More significantly, B-29 production was accelerating rather than declining. New assembly lines were reaching peak efficiency. Worker training had improved. Supply chains were fully established. Monthly production in early 1945 would likely exceed 400 aircraft, potentially reaching 500 by summer if the war continued. The operational analysis section documented B-29 deployment patterns and mission effectiveness. By late 1944, approximately 600 B-29 seconds were operational in the Pacific, organized into very heavy bombardment groups operating from bases in China, India, and increasingly from newly captured islands in the Marianas. These forces were conducting regular missions against Japanese targets, destroying industrial facilities, disrupting logistics, and preparing for even more intensive operations. Intelligence from Japan indicated B-29 operations were having devastating effects. Japanese fighter defenses struggled to intercept bombers operating above 30,000 feet. Anti-aircraft fire proved relatively ineffective at such altitudes. Japanese industrial production was declining under systematic American bombing. Most significantly, American losses remained sustainable, while Japanese defensive capabilities degraded steadily through attrition. Von Roenne's report included section analyzing probable B-29 operations if deployed against Germany. The analysis was methodical and terrifying. B-29 seconds operating from English bases could reach any German target with substantial bomb loads. They could operate at altitudes where German fighter interception would be difficult, even with jet-powered aircraft. Their defensive firepower would inflict heavy losses on attacking fighters. Most critically, American production could sustain operations indefinitely while replacing losses. The report calculated that 500 B-29 seconds operating against Germany could deliver approximately 10,000 tons of bombs monthly, in addition to existing B-17 and B-24 operations. This additional bombing weight would overwhelm German air defenses, destroy remaining industrial capacity, and make continued military production impossible. German cities would experience destruction comparable to what American forces were inflicting on Japan. The civilian population would face catastrophic casualties. The strategic recommendations section was brief and devastating. Germany could not defend against B-29 operations if Americans chose to deploy them to Europe. Jet fighter production could not reach quantities sufficient to contest air superiority. Anti-aircraft defenses lacked the altitude capability to engage high-flying bombers effectively. Fighter-bomber attacks could disrupt B-29 bases, but could not prevent operations given American defensive capabilities and rapid repair capacity. The only effective response would be ending the war before B-29 deployment to Europe became operationally necessary. Continued resistance into mid- or late 1945 would inevitably result in B-29 campaigns against German targets. These campaigns would succeed in destroying German war-making capacity completely. The cost in civilian casualties and urban destruction would be catastrophic. Von Roenne concluded his report with observation that should have been obvious but apparently required explicit statement. Modern industrial warfare between advanced nations is decided by production capacity rather than tactical excellence or technological innovation. The United States possesses production capacity exceeding Germany's by factors ranging from 3 to 5 across all categories of military equipment. This disparity makes German military victory impossible, regardless of tactical or operational success. Continued military resistance can only increase the magnitude of ultimate defeat without changing the inevitable outcome. The report was submitted to the High Command on January 15, 1945. It was received, acknowledged, filed, and ignored. Intelligence officers had documented mathematical certainty of defeat, with overwhelming evidence. Military and political leadership preferred to believe in secret weapons, wonder technologies, and ideological determination rather than accept arithmetic reality. But individual officers who read von Roenne's report understood its implications. Some began quietly preparing for Germany's inevitable defeat. Others redoubled their efforts to develop weapons that might still change strategic outcomes. A few, including von Roenne himself, became involved in plots to remove Hitler from power, recognizing that only political change could end the war before Germany's complete destruction. The irony was that von Roenne's analysis of American B-29 production proved conservative rather than alarmist. By war's end in August 1945, American production totaled approximately 3,970 B-29 seconds, exceeding even the most alarming projections from German intelligence. The production achievement was so extraordinary that even accurate intelligence reports seemed like exaggeration. America had spent $3 billion developing and producing the B-29, equivalent to approximately $60 billion in current terms. This represented more than the entire cost of the Manhattan Project that developed atomic weapons. The scale of investment demonstrated that Americans viewed strategic bombing capability as more important than nuclear weapons development, at least until late in the war when atomic bombs became deliverable. The B-29 program's cost and scale would have been impossible for Germany even in the best circumstances. Germany's entire military budget for 1944 totaled roughly 80 billion Reichsmarks, equivalent perhaps to $20 billion at wartime exchange rates. The Americans had spent an amount equal to 15% of Germany's total annual military budget on a single aircraft program, while simultaneously funding hundreds of other weapons programs, maintaining massive ground and naval forces, supporting allied nations through Lend-Lease, and conducting research into advanced technologies. This casual deployment of overwhelming resources characterized every aspect of American war production. They built approximately 300,000 aircraft total during the war. They produced approximately 88,000 tanks. They constructed nearly 3,000 merchant ships. They manufactured over 40 million tons of artillery ammunition. In every category, American production exceeded German output by factors of 2 to 5, while simultaneously supplying Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allied nations with enormous quantities of weapons and supplies. The mathematical reality that German intelligence officers documented was simple and brutal. America could produce more, faster, and better than Germany. This advantage meant American victory was inevitable once their production reached full capacity. The outcome was probably determined by late 1943, certainly by mid-1944. Everything that followed was simply working through the mathematical implications of overwhelming material superiority. The B-29 Superfortress symbolized this reality more clearly than any other weapon. The most technologically advanced aircraft ever built at that time, produced in quantities exceeding Germany's total bomber production. Each aircraft cost more than most German tanks, yet Americans built them faster than Germany built fighters. The entire program represented investment that exceeded small nations' military budgets, casually undertaken while fighting global war on multiple fronts. German engineers, when they finally encountered B-29 seconds after the war, were impressed by the technical sophistication, but not surprised by the capabilities. Intelligence reports had accurately described the aircraft's performance and characteristics. What impressed them more was the production achievement. The systematic application of industrial capacity to create thousands of highly complex aircraft represented organizational and economic capability that German industry could never match. The Soviet Union, which captured 3 B-29 seconds that made emergency landings in Soviet territory during 1944, spent years reverse engineering the aircraft into the Tupolev Tu-4. The effort required 900 factories and research institutes, involved over 100,000 engineers and workers, and took nearly 3 years to complete. The Soviets, with their centralized economy and enormous resources, found duplicating the B-29 to be one of the most challenging projects undertaken during the late 1940s. If the Soviet Union, with its vast resources and industrial capacity, found copying the B-29 extraordinarily difficult, Germany could never have produced equivalent aircraft even if given complete technical documentation. The production achievement was more impressive than the technical design. Creating thousands of sophisticated aircraft required organizational capability, industrial infrastructure, and resource availability that Germany simply did not possess. This realization, gradually accepted by German intelligence officers and technical experts during 1944 and 1945, represented final abandonment of hope for military victory. If Americans could produce aircraft like the B-29 inches such quantities, while simultaneously maintaining overwhelming superiority in all other weapons categories, then no tactical excellence, no technological breakthrough, no ideological determination could change the war's outcome. Germany was being defeated by arithmetic, and arithmetic always wins. The human cost of leadership's refusal to accept these mathematical realities was staggering. Germany fought for approximately 8 months after von Roenne submitted his B-29 report in January 1945. During those 8 months, hundreds of thousands of soldiers died in fighting that accomplished nothing strategically. Millions of civilians perished in bombing raids, ground combat, and systematic killings. German cities were progressively destroyed. The nation's industrial capacity was obliterated. The social and political structure of Germany collapsed completely. All of this destruction occurred after intelligence officers had documented, with mathematical certainty, that Germany could not win. Professional military analysis clearly indicated that continued resistance would only increase the magnitude of defeat without changing the outcome. But this analysis was systematically ignored by leadership, who preferred ideology and fantasy to evidence and arithmetic. Von Roenne himself did not live to see the war's end. He was arrested in July 1944 for peripheral involvement in the July 20th plot against Hitler. Though his participation was minimal, knowing of the conspiracy without reporting it, the Nazi regime executed him on October 12, 1944. His death removed one of Germany's most competent intelligence analysts, a professional officer who had tried repeatedly to provide accurate assessment of enemy capabilities so leadership could make informed decisions. The tragedy was not just personal but institutional. Nazi Germany literally killed the messenger for bringing unwelcome truths. Intelligence services that should have informed strategy instead became irrelevant, as leadership rejected any analysis that contradicted ideological beliefs. Professional competence became dangerous when it produced conclusions incompatible with political requirements. The systematic rejection of accurate intelligence represented organizational failure that guaranteed strategic disaster. The B-29 Superfortress story, from German intelligence perspective, exemplifies larger patterns that determined the war's outcome. American industrial capacity exceeded German production by overwhelming margins. This advantage translated directly into military superiority across all domains. Professional German intelligence officers documented this reality meticulously, presenting clear evidence and sound analysis. Their warnings were systematically ignored by leadership who could not accept that ideology and determination were insufficient against overwhelming material disadvantage. Looking back from 8 decades later, the German intelligence assessment of B-29 production appears both prescient and tragically futile. The analysts were correct in every major conclusion. American production capacity was overwhelming. The B-29 represented technological and manufacturing achievement Germany could not match. Deployment of B-29 seconds to Europe would have resulted in catastrophic destruction. Continued resistance would only increase the magnitude of defeat. But this accurate analysis changed nothing. Leadership refused to accept mathematical reality. The war continued until Germany's complete military collapse, until cities were ruins, until millions more were dead, until the evidence of defeat was written in occupied territory and unconditional surrender. The intelligence officers who understood the inevitability of defeat in January 1945 had to watch as their nation destroyed itself over the following months, knowing the outcome but powerless to change it. The B-29 Superfortress never flew combat missions over Germany. American planners determined that B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds were adequate for European operations, and concentrated B-29 production in the Pacific, where the aircraft's long range was essential. This decision spared Germany from experiencing the full weight of B-29 operations, though conventional bombing by B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds was devastating enough. Japanese cities suffered under B-29 campaigns that German cities escaped, experiencing destruction of unprecedented scale and intensity. But the threat of B-29 deployment to Europe served strategic purpose even without actual operations. German air defences had to prepare for potential Superfortress attacks. Resources were allocated to developing high-altitude interceptors. Intelligence efforts focused on tracking B-29 production and capabilities. The mere existence of the B-29 program forced Germany to respond to a threat that never materialized, diverting limited resources from other priorities. This strategic benefit cost America essentially nothing beyond the propaganda effort of flying the Hobo Queen to England in early 1944. The casual ability to create strategic effects through deception, using weapons too abundant to matter if diverted from combat operations, itself demonstrated overwhelming material superiority. Only a nation with production capacity exceeding all military requirements could afford to deploy expensive aircraft on propaganda missions with no combat value. The legacy of German intelligence analysis of the B-29 extends beyond World War II's immediate outcome. The lessons about industrial capacity determining modern warfare outcomes influenced Cold War strategic thinking. Understanding that production capability mattered more than individual weapons excellence shaped Soviet and American approaches to military development. The recognition that modern war between industrial powers was fundamentally economic competition before it became a military conflict informed strategic planning for decades. The B-29 itself continued service long after World War II ended, flying combat missions in Korea, serving as the basis for aerial refueling tankers, operating in reconnaissance and research roles, until finally being retired in 1960. The aircraft's operational longevity demonstrated the quality of the original design, even as more advanced aircraft superseded it. But the B-29's greatest significance was not its technical capabilities, but what its production represented. American industrial dominance so complete that Germany could only document its inevitability while being crushed by its application. German intelligence officers who studied the B-29 understood they were witnessing not just a superior aircraft, but a superior system of industrial organization. The casual efficiency with which America produced thousands of highly complex aircraft while fighting global war on multiple fronts represented organizational and economic capability that Germany could never match regardless of effort or sacrifice. This understanding, reached through careful analysis of available evidence, should have informed strategic decisions. Instead, it was ignored, and millions paid the price for willful blindness to mathematical reality. The story of German intelligence and the B-29 Superfortress is ultimately a story about the irrelevance of accurate information when leadership refuses to accept unwelcome truths. Professional analysis, carefully documented evidence, sound military judgment, all became worthless when contradicting political requirements. The intelligence officers knew Germany could not win, proved it mathematically, and watched helplessly as their nation pursued inevitable defeat with ideological determination disconnected from material reality. In the end, American factories produced 3,970 B-29 Superfortress bombers, each one a testament to industrial capacity that German analysts had documented but leadership refused to acknowledge. Those aircraft helped end the war in the Pacific, supported American strategic power for years afterward, and symbolized the decisive advantage of overwhelming production in modern industrial warfare. German intelligence officers had understood all of this in 1944. Their tragedy was that understanding changed nothing, and mathematics proceeded to its inevitable conclusion, regardless of human wishes or ideological commitments. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.